In a small town nestled in the heart of America, there lived an 80-year-old woman named Margaret who believed in the goodness of people. She trusted a warm voice on the phone. She believed a stranger's urgent plea. And for a brief, terrifying moment, everyone around her feared she'd lost everything to a con artist. But what the scammer didn't know was that Margaret had been married to a detective for 53 years. What he didn't expect was that an 80-year-old woman could be 3 steps ahead of him the entire time. This is the story of how Margaret turned the tables and reminded a world full of cynics that sometimes wisdom runs deeper than any scheme. Margaret Ellen Pritchard lived in a house that hadn't changed much since 1987. The kitchen still had the same floral wallpaper. The refrigerator still hummed the same tune it had hummed for 30 years. And every morning at 6:47 a.m., without fail, Margaret made a pot of coffee in the same ceramic percolator that her husband, Detective Robert Pritchard, had given her as an engagement gift in 1954. Robert had passed away 11 years ago. Heart attack. Sudden. The kind of sudden that leaves a hole in the fabric of a life that never quite stitches back together. But his presence lingered in that house like the smell of old coffee grounds and pipe tobacco. Margaret poured her coffee into a china cup, never a mug, always china, and shuffled into the sunroom. This was her sanctuary. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the backyard, where she maintained bird feeders that attracted cardinals, chickadees, and the occasional blue jay. She kept a leather-bound journal beside her chair where she logged the birds she saw. 3 cardinals this morning. She noted the date and time, as if documenting evidence. She supposed that was Robert's influence, the detective's meticulous mind rubbing off on her after 53 years. The house was quiet. Most days, that was fine. Margaret had never been the type to need constant noise. She read extensively, mysteries mostly, though she also enjoyed historical fiction and the occasional romance novel, which she kept in a small stack in her bedroom, with the covers facing the wall, a leftover modesty from an older generation. She wrote letters, long, thoughtful letters to her children and grandchildren, written by hand with a fountain pen. She found emails too abrupt, too modern, lacking the intimacy of ink on paper. But if Margaret was honest with herself, and she had learned to be, in her 8th decade of life, she sometimes felt a particular kind of loneliness on gray Wednesdays and Sunday afternoons. It was the loneliness of having raised 2 children, seen them build their own lives in distant cities, and settled into the reality that they were busy. They loved her. Of course they loved her. But they had mortgages and school schedules and demanding jobs. Visits happened once, maybe twice a year. She didn't blame them. She understood it. But understanding didn't prevent her from staring at old photographs of Robert on the fireplace mantel. Robert in his detective's uniform, proud and handsome. Robert in an armchair with their daughter on his lap. Robert at their 50th anniversary party, his arm around Margaret's waist, both of them laughing at something now forgotten. The loneliness was the price of having lived so long, and Margaret had made peace with that price. What she hadn't made peace with was the feeling of being left behind by the modern world. Technology had changed so much. Her neighbor Ethel had tried to teach her to send emails on a computer. Margaret had a cell phone now, a simple one, bought at her daughter's insistence, but she rarely knew how to use it properly. She used the house phone more often than not. It was familiar. It felt like Robert's era. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, Margaret went to the community center, where she helped with the bridge club and staffed the front desk. The other women her age, Ethel, Marion, Dot, had become her closest friends. They gossiped, laughed, complained about their knees, and compared notes on their grandchildren. "You should come to the bingo night," Ethel had urged her last week. "We need good people." Margaret had smiled and said maybe. It was a small life, but it was hers. Structured, predictable, built on routines that made the days feel manageable and the nights feel less heavy. She had the community center. She had her birds. She had her books and her letters, and the familiar creak of the floorboards in her hallway. She did not have surprises. She did not, at that particular moment in September, have any idea that her entire world was about to shift. Margaret was, above all else, a good listener. Robert used to say that was what made her remarkable. In his line of work, in police work, he encountered people who talked a lot but listened to nothing. They performed empathy but felt nothing. Margaret was the opposite. She listened with the whole of herself. She listened to the tone beneath the words. She listened to what was left unsaid. She was polite. She was trusting. She was, in every way that mattered in 1950s, exactly the kind of woman you could build a life with. And in 2024, she was exactly the kind of woman a scammer dreams about finding on the other end of the phone. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone rang. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing lunch, a modest salad and some soup. She had just come home from the community center, where she'd spent the morning filing paperwork and helping someone learn to use the copy machine. She was tired, in the way that 60-year-olds dream about being tired when they're 80. It was a good tired, the kind that made you feel useful. She answered on the third ring. "Hello?" A muffled, panicked voice came through on the other end. Traffic in the background. A young man's voice, strained and frightened. "Grandma? Grandma, is that you?" Margaret's hand tightened on the receiver. She knew all her grandchildren's voices. She had recorded some of them, their laughs, their stories, in the vault of her memory. But this voice was unfamiliar. "I'm sorry," she said carefully. "Who is this?" "It's me. It's your grandson. Grandma, I'm in so much trouble. I'm in the hospital. There was an accident. I need help, please. I'm so scared." Sirens sounded in the background. More chaos. The sound of a phone being fumbled. Margaret's heart seized. Her first instinct was maternal, biological, automatic. A crisis. Her grandchild in danger. But her second instinct, the one that had been honed by 53 years of marriage to a man who listened for inconsistencies, was to pause. "Which hospital?" she asked, her voice still steady. "And which grandson are you? I need to know." There was a pause. It's happening so fast. "Grandma, they're putting me on with my lawyer. I can't explain now. Just, I need money. Please. I'll explain everything." The phone rustled. A new voice, an older man, smooth, professional, confident. "Mrs. Pritchard, this is attorney David Morrison. I'm representing your grandson. He's been in a vehicular accident. No need for alarm, but there are some immediate legal and medical expenses. The sooner we can secure payment, the sooner we can move forward with his case." Margaret felt it then, that first surge of fear. Her mind divided into two parts. One part wanted to help her grandson. The other part was listening to the silence between the words. She was listening to what wasn't being said. "I want to speak to my grandson again," she said. Of course," the lawyer said smoothly. "But Mrs. Pritchard, time is of the essence here. If we can get the paperwork started." "I want to speak to my grandson," Margaret repeated. Not unkindly. Just clearly. The young man came back on the line, agitated, apologetic, panicked. "Grandma, please, I can't. They're telling me I can't talk long. I just need you to help me. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want this on my record." And then Margaret asked the question that would, in retrospect, save her. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "what's your dog's name? I want to make sure I'm really talking to my grandson. I need to make sure you are really you." It was a long silence. Grandma, they're taking the phone again. I don't have time for games. Please, I'm begging you." and the line clicked. The lawyer came back. "Mrs. Pritchard, I understand you're upset, but I assure you, your grandson is in a delicate position. The sooner we can." Margaret hung up the phone. She sat very still in her kitchen, the dial tone buzzing in the silence. Her heart was racing, but her mind was clear. Something was wrong. Margaret did something then that a lesser person might not have done. She didn't panic. She didn't immediately call her children. Instead, she did what Robert would have done. She listened to her instinct, and she waited. The phone rang again at 3:15 p.m. This time, Margaret was prepared. She had written down the previous conversation in her notebook, word for word, as much as she could remember. Detective's habit, Robert's habit, now hers. "Hello?" she answered, keeping her voice steady. It was the lawyer again. "Mrs. Pritchard, I apologize for the disconnection. These situations are always stressful. Now, regarding the bail amount and the medical expenses, I need to speak to my grandson," Margaret said. "He's been sedated," the lawyer replied smoothly. "Mrs. Pritchard, I understand your concern, but what's critical right now is action. The bail hearing is tomorrow morning. If we don't have funds secured by 8 a.m., he'll be detained pending trial. This could affect his future employment, his reputation." Margaret listened. She listened to the pressure in his voice. Not obvious, but there. The subtle manipulation. His future, his reputation. The idea that she alone could prevent catastrophe. It was a good con. Very good. "How much?" she asked quietly. $20,000, he said. "I know it's significant, but it can be paid back once his case is settled." Margaret's hand trembled slightly, but her voice did not. "I'll need to think about this," she said. "Mrs. Pritchard, I said I'll think about it. I'll call you back." She hung up before he could respond. Now she called her daughter, Susan. Susan lived in Denver with her husband and 2 children. She was a litigation attorney herself. Sharp, practical, almost too busy. Margaret didn't like to bother her with concerns. But this was a concern. "Mom?" Susan answered on the first ring. "Everything okay?" "Hi, sweetie. I got a call from someone claiming to be your son or your brother. He said he was my grandson and that he was in an accident and that—" Susan cut her off. "Put the phone down, Mom. Don't call that number back. It's a scam. It's called the grandparent scam. It's very common, and I want you to listen carefully. Do not give them any money. Do not call back. Hang up if they call again." And there it was. Confirmation. The thing Margaret's instinct had been whispering, now spoken aloud. She was nearly scammed. "Oh," Margaret said quietly. "Mom, are you okay? Did you give them anything?" "No," Margaret said. "No, I asked my grandson what his dog's name was. He couldn't answer. And then, well, I hung up." There was a pause on the line. "You did what?" "I asked him to tell me his dog's name. When he couldn't, I knew something was wrong." Susan let out a laugh, part relief, part amazement. "Mom, that's brilliant. That's actually brilliant." But Margaret was quiet, because even though she'd caught the scam, she had something else now, an idea, a small growing kernel of a thought that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with justice. So when the phone rang again at 5 p.m., Margaret answered. "Hello? Mrs. Pritchard, thank goodness. Your grandson wants to talk to you. He's conscious now." "That's wonderful," Margaret said. And she meant it. She meant every word, even as she lied. "I'm so glad, and I've thought about your offer. I can help. I want to help, but I need to meet someone in person. I need to hand over the money myself. I need to know it's going to the right place." There was a pause. That won't be necessary, Mrs. Pritchard. We can arrange for a wire transfer." "I want to meet," Margaret said firmly. "I've lived 80 years, and I don't give money to people I haven't looked in the eye. Surely you understand. Surely you can respect that." The lawyer hesitated. Margaret could hear him thinking. could hear him calculating whether this was a Mark who was going to fold or if she was trouble. "All right," he said finally. "All right, let's arrange a meeting. Tomorrow morning. Will that work?" "That will work perfectly," Margaret said. After she hung up, Margaret did 3 things. First, she called her neighbor Tom, a retired military officer who lived 3 houses down. She explained everything. Tom listened without interrupting. "I want you to know what's happening," she told him. "And I want you to be there tomorrow, just nearby, just in case." "You got it," Tom said. Second, she called the sheriff's office. She reported the scam and explained what was about to happen. The officer who took her call sounded impressed. "You're going to help us catch him?" the officer asked. "I'm going to try," Margaret said quietly. Third, she sat down at her kitchen table and she wrote a note, not to the scammer, not yet, but to herself. A reminder of why she was doing this. It said, "For all the people he's fooled before. For all the people he'll fool again if he isn't stopped. For Robert, who always said that small acts of courage are still courage." Then she prepared an envelope. Into it, she placed 20 crisp $1 bills folded into a rectangle. On top of that, she placed a single sheet of paper. She sealed it carefully. That night, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She couldn't sleep. She sat in her sunroom in the darkness. She didn't turn on the lights. She just sat there, listening to the sounds of her house, the old pipes, the settling foundation, the wind in the eaves, the ticking of the clock. She was afraid. She would be dishonest if she said otherwise. But underneath the fear was something else. A quiet determination, a sense that this was exactly what Robert would have wanted her to do. That night, Margaret made a decision. She wasn't going to be a victim. She was going to be something far more powerful. She was going to be a witness. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. at a public park near Margaret's house. She was to look for a man in a red jacket carrying a briefcase. He would approach her at a bench near the playground. Margaret arrived at 7:45. She was wearing a small microphone clipped to her cardigan. The sheriff's deputy was parked nearby in an unmarked car. Tom was in his truck. Margaret felt surrounded by guardians, though no one could see them. She felt older than 80 suddenly. She felt like she was walking through water, but her hands were steady. Her mind was clear. At 8:03 a.m., a man in a red jacket appeared. He was younger than Margaret expected, maybe 40. Handsome, even. He had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that made you want to trust him. He was carrying a black briefcase. He sat down next to her on the bench, leaving a respectful distance. "Mrs. Pritchard?" he said. "Yes," Margaret said. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, and his voice, it was warm. Genuinely warm, or so good at pretending that it amounted to the same thing. "I know this must be stressful for you. Your grandson is very lucky to have a grandmother who cares so much." Margaret felt something then. Not anger exactly, something more complicated. Pity, perhaps, or sadness for what this man had become. What choice, what desperation, what broken thing inside him had led him to spend his life lying to 80-year-old women? But she pushed the feeling aside. Justice first, compassion later. "I have the money," Margaret said quietly. She held up the envelope. "But before I give it to you, I need to tell you something." The man's expression shifted, just slightly. Just a microscopic change in the muscles around his eyes. But Margaret saw it. Robert had taught her to see things like that. "I need to tell you," Margaret continued, "that my late husband was a detective. He taught me to listen carefully, to watch what people don't say as much as what they do. And when I asked my grandson what his dog's name was, and he couldn't answer, well, that's when I knew something wasn't right." A man's hand moved slightly toward the briefcase. "So I called my daughter," Margaret continued, "and she explained what you were doing, what you're actually doing. And I realized something. I realized that you probably do this to someone every single week. maybe more than once a week. You probably have a very good success rate because people trust you, because you're good at what you do. She paused. But you're not good at everything, Margaret said softly. You're not good at remembering that we're human beings, that we have families, that we have memories, that we have people who love us. The man stood up abruptly. I don't know what you're... The envelope is for you, Margaret interrupted. She held it out. Please, open it. Something about her voice, something old and sad and matter-of-fact, made him hesitate. He took the envelope. He opened it. Inside were $21 bills and a single piece of paper. On it, in Margaret's careful handwriting, were these words: next time you try to scam someone's grandma, make sure she didn't marry a detective. I'm sorry your life led you to this place, and I hope you choose differently from here on out. May God help you. The man's face changed. Margaret watched it happen. The moment he understood. The moment he realized he'd been caught. Not just caught, outsmarted. That's when the unmarked car pulled up. 2 sheriff's deputies stepped out, followed by 2 more from a second vehicle. The man in the red jacket didn't run. He just stood there, holding the envelope in Margaret's note, looking at it like it was the most devastating thing he'd ever read. You're under arrest, one of the deputies said, and they cuffed him with professional efficiency. As they were putting him into the police car, the man looked back at Margaret. Their eyes met. She saw regret in his face, or perhaps she saw what she wanted to see. Either way, she raised one hand in a small wave. Not a wave of goodbye, but a wave that said, I forgive you, but there are consequences. Tom was out of his truck, running toward her. Are you okay? He was asking. Are you hurt? Margaret smiled at him. I'm fine, she said. I'm better than fine. I'm exactly what I've needed to be for a very long time. The story went viral, as things do in the age of social media. Local hero catches grandson scammer, the headlines read. 80-year-old woman outwits criminal mastermind. Grandparent scam ring broken thanks to detective's widow. A news station sent a crew to Margaret's house to do a profile. She was reluctant, but agreed. She wore her good cardigan. She sat in her armchair, the one by the window where the light was kind to her face. How did you know? The reporter asked. I asked him a simple question. His name. I asked him to tell me something only my real grandson would know. He couldn't do it. But many people would have been fooled. Yes, many people would have been, and many have been. My daughter told me that scammers target 10-15 people a day. Most don't catch on. Most send the money. I was lucky. I had a lifetime of training. My husband taught me that the details matter, that listening matters, that paying attention, real attention, is a form of love. The interview aired on a Thursday evening. By Friday morning, Margaret had received calls from 3 local news stations and 1 reporter from a newspaper in Kansas City. By Saturday, there was a small article in the national news section of the New York Times. But more importantly, there was something else. Letters came, dozens of them. People writing to thank her for what she'd done. People sharing their own stories of elderly relatives who had been scammed, of money lost, of trust broken, of lives disrupted. One letter was from a woman named Helen in Nebraska. She wrote, My mother lost $20,000 to a man just like the one you caught. She never recovered from the shame. Your courage gives me hope that justice is still possible. Another was from a man in Oklahoma named David. He wrote, I was a scammer for 15 years. I saw your story. It made me think about all the people I hurt. It made me think about the mothers and grandmothers. Today, I called the police and confessed. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to choose differently. Margaret read every letter. She kept them in a box by her bed. A local sheriff's department asked if she would help them teach a class on how to identify scams. She agreed. She spent every Thursday afternoon at the community center, teaching other people her age how to listen carefully, how to ask the questions that reveal the truth. Ethel attended the first class. So did Marion and Dot. And over the months, dozens of others learned Margaret's simple but profound method. Pay attention. Listen carefully. Ask for proof. One afternoon, about 6 months after the man in the red jacket was arrested, Margaret received a visitor. It was the prosecutor on the case. She brought news. The man had pleaded guilty. He was part of a larger ring operating out of 3 states. The information Margaret had provided, combined with the evidence from the sting operation, had helped convict him and 8 other individuals. They were all serving time now. Because of you, the prosecutor said, hundreds of other people will be protected. Margaret nodded. She felt no triumph in this, just a quiet sense of rightness. That evening, Margaret sat in her sunroom, as she always did. She had her coffee, now cold, but she didn't mind. She was looking at the photographs on the mantel. Robert in his uniform. Robert with their children. Robert laughing at something she could no longer remember. She took down the photograph of him at his desk. Working on a case, his brow was furrowed, his jaw was set. He looked determined, righteous, strong. "I did what you would have done," she said to the photograph. "I listened, I paid attention, I did what was right." A cardinal landed on the bird feeder outside her window. She noted it in her journal. The 3rd cardinal this week. She was still documenting, still observing, still paying attention to the details that make life worth living. On her lap was a letter she had been writing by hand to her grandson, her real grandson. In it, she told him the whole story. She didn't hide anything. She wanted him to know that his grandmother had been brave. She wanted him to know that sometimes the smallest act of attention can change everything. She signed it, "With love and admiration for the good work you do in the world, from your very alert grandma." In the aftermath of all this, Margaret learned something about herself. She learned that she had been underestimating her own power. For 80 years, she had accepted the role that society had written for her: the quiet woman, the good listener, the grandmother who appreciated visits but didn't demand them, the elderly person who faded into the background of other people's lives. But the truth, she realized, was more complicated. She had been powerful all along. She had always had the capacity to pay attention, to listen closely, to ask the hard questions and wait patiently for answers. The confidence to trust her instincts, even when they contradicted what she was being told. She had simply never been asked to use those gifts in the way she was meant to. This is what the world forgets about older people. We are not diminished by our years. We are not less than for having lived a long time. We are, in fact, repositories of wisdom. We have learned how to listen in a world that doesn't listen enough. We have learned how to pay attention. We have learned how to distinguish truth from lies, real love from manipulation, genuine connection from performance. We are not relics. We are witnesses. We are teachers. We are still necessary. Margaret Pritchard, 81 years old, watered her garden and smiled at the cardinals and answered her phone when her family called. She lived quietly, as she had always lived. But quietly does not mean passively. Quietly does not mean without power in a world full of scams, full of manipulation, full of people trying to take what doesn't belong to them. Sometimes wisdom is the strongest defense. And sometimes all it takes to change the world is one woman who decided to pay attention. Margaret's story reminds us that every one of us has something to teach. Every one of us has the capacity to be brave. Every one of us has the power to make a difference. If only we trust ourselves enough to try. May we all be as alert as Margaret. May we all be as brave. And may we never forget, the smallest act of attention can be a form of heroism.